So we've examined Mendel's rules of inheritance, and we've seen that individuals have two different alleles, one that they inherited from each parent, and those two alleles interact to lead to specific phenotypes or physical characteristics that we can see in an organism. We also learned about complete dominance and how if an individual has two different alleles, one allele will be dominant and one will be recessive. So if an individual is heterozygous and they have one dominant allele and one recessive allele, the dominant trait or phenotype will be expressed and the recessive allele won't be visible in the phenotype of the individual. Because Mendel studied the traits of pea plants, he was able to identify a lot of characters that are controlled through complete dominance. There are exceptions to Mendel's rules of inheritance. Most genes are controlled by more than just two alleles, and many traits are controlled by more than one gene, and so it takes multiple gene products or proteins to lead to the trait that is expressed in an individual. And it's not just one gene that controls our traits. So what we're going to do next is take a look at some of these more complex inheritance patterns and start to build an understanding of the complexity that surrounds inheritance and many of the traits that aren't inherited through simple complete dominance. So what happens when you have a character where one allele doesn't show complete dominance over another allele? There are a couple of different types of inheritance that show this pattern. First is incomplete dominance. This is when you have an individual that is heterozygous for a trait or has two different alleles that shows a blend of the homozygous traits. For instance, in mirabilis flowers, you can have red flowers and you can have white flowers. If you were to cross a red flowered plant with a white flowered plant, you would end up with offspring that have a genotype for red and white. And instead of expressing red or white, they express a blend of the traits, so you would see pink flowers. This is called incomplete dominance because neither trait is completely dominant, and the heterozygous trait is a blend of the two homozygous traits. Using a Punnett square, we can examine this example of incomplete dominance. Big R represents the red allele, little r represents the white allele. So if we cross a homozygous white with a homozygous red flower, we see that all of the individuals have the genotype big R, little r with the phenotype pink, which is a blend of both of the homozygous traits. A second type of inheritance pattern that varies from complete dominance is called codominance. Like the name would suggest, the two different alleles are expressed together. For instance, in a variety of chicken, you can have an allele for black feathers and an allele for white feathers. And if you were to mate a black feathered chicken with a white feathered chicken, you would get offspring that would have one of each allele, and so their heterozygous genotype would be represented as a speckled black and white feathered phenotype. So instead of seeing gray feathers, which would happen if it was incomplete dominance, here we see both black and white speckles in the feathers because both traits are being expressed together. If we use a Punnett square to examine this example of codominance, capital B represents black feathers, capital W represents white feathers. So if we cross two parents that are homozygous, or capital B with capital W, all offspring would be capital W, capital B with black and white speckled feathers. So this means both traits are being expressed in the chicken. Another inheritance pattern that varies from Mendel's inheritance patterns occurs when you have genes that exist with multiple versions of that gene. So multiple alleles. For instance, in flower color we saw the purple allele and the white allele. But in some characters, there are more than just two versions of that character, or more than just two versions of the trait. So when this is the case, and you have more than just two versions of the trait, this gene is said to be controlled by multiple alleles. So you have more than just two alleles that interact and lead to the expression of the phenotype. However, individuals still only have two alleles for the trait because they inherited one from their mom and one from their dad. However, in the population, there are more than 2 possible versions that could be inherited. A common example of this is seen in human blood type. For humans, there are 4 different traits for blood type: A, B, AB, and O. And these 4 different possible traits are controlled by 3 different alleles: I superscript A, I superscript B, and a little I. And it's interactions between these alleles that leads to the 4 different phenotypes that can be expressed in the blood types. Again, each individual only has 2 alleles, but there are more possible combinations of alleles that you could receive. And because of those increased number of combinations, there are more combinations or versions of the trait. Finally, many of our traits are controlled by the interactions between many different genes and are said to be polygenic. Poly meaning many, genic referring to genes. For instance, our skin color is controlled by how much pigment melanin is produced in our skin cells. The more melanin that is produced, the darker your skin. There are at least 4 different genes that control the production of the melanin protein in our skin cells. And it's the interaction between the dominant and recessive versions of these different genes that leads to the phenotype or physical characteristic that is seen in each individual person. Because there are more possible combinations of dominant and recessive alleles that control this trait, there are more possible combinations of physical traits that we can observe. So that's why we see a wide variety of skin tones in our population. So now we've examined complete dominance, where one allele is dominant over a second allele. We've looked at incomplete dominance, where an individual who is heterozygous for a trait expresses a phenotype or physical characteristic that is in the middle between each of the homozygous physical traits. Codominance, where the 2 alleles are expressed together. We've looked at traits that are controlled by multiple alleles, more than just one dominant and one recessive allele, and the variation in alleles leads to more variation in physical traits. And finally, we've talked about polygenic traits, traits that are controlled by many genes, and it's the interaction between the products of these many genes that leads to a wide variety of phenotypes or physical traits that we observe. So this is going to wrap up our study of inheritance patterns within the field of genetics. Next, we'll start to look at the actual molecules that are passed from parent to offspring and how those molecules lead to the physical traits that we can see in an individual.